Okay, great. So I'm on. So let me just get into the right screen. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Hope you all have been having a great day. It's always interesting being the last speaker for the day, but I'm really glad to be here. Wish I could have been in Rome in person, but that just wasn't going to happen this year. Maybe next year that will happen. There we go. So sure enough, you've all seen this slide a bunch of times today, but definitely want to make sure we thank the sponsors. This is a free event, and a free event cannot happen without sponsors like this. So definitely want to thank all of those. My name is Chad Green. I am the senior software architect at a company called Jasper Engines. You would not have heard of us because we are only based here in the United States and Canada, but obviously we build engines and do a lot of interesting work with that. And we're building our first set of cloud infrastructure. I was recently hired. I joined the company 6 months ago to help them on that progress. Lots of legacy code that we're moving up. Sure enough, here is all my contact information. Definitely feel free to reach out. That's why I put it on here. And as the badge says at the bottom, I am a Microsoft MVP in both developer technologies and in Azure. So obviously that means I speak quite a bit about such technologies. So let's get into what we've got to talk about. And I will say I do not speak Italian. I did translate those. If those translations are wrong, it's supposed to be Prelude. You can blame Google Translate because I just asked it to translate those. But let's talk about Azure Functions in general, right? And what are we talking about? So, sure enough, the idea of Azure Functions is we're taking our code and we're taking our events and data and we're putting those together, right? And sure enough, I loved the first time I saw that animation. I never realized that's what the logo meant until I saw that animation. But yeah, that is the whole idea. That's easily put up a piece of code to respond to something that happened, and then do what we need to do. So just quickly, because I'm assuming most of you all have done something with Azure Functions. It's been out for quite some time, and sure enough, Azure Functions is a competitor to AWS Lambdas and Google Cloud Functions. So it's a well-established thing within software development. But a couple features that we do talk about when we talk about Azure Functions. First and foremost, I was alluding to it on the last slide, the fact that it's event-driven triggers and bindings. So something happens, and because of that, you fire off a piece of code. And that something could be something as simple as an HTTP request. It could be a message going into your service bus or into your event hub. That last presentation, right? Nikos was talking about how you're using Azure Functions. Same idea, right? Things happen on those robots, and so a trigger happens to do what needs to be done. The next feature is you do have your choice of language. Sure enough, we have the obvious ones, C# and F# and JavaScript. But also, if you're developing in Java or you're developing in Python, right, or Bash or PowerShell, these are all possible. And really what this helps with, one, to keep with the language you do. So if you're a Java shop, you can develop in Java, in the Azure Functions. But also, think about the Python part. When we talk about machine learning type code, Python generally is really good at that, especially it has some really good libraries with that. And so, you can use the right languages for what you're doing. Next big thing is the development tool integrations. So, whether I'm using Visual Studio Code or I'm using Visual Studio, really great tooling to make, to easily work with Azure Functions. There is the function CLI, so that, I could also, work with other IDEs. I can work directly in the console. So really great things. On top of that, tying in with source control. So whether that's in GitHub, Azure DevOps, or even things like Bitbucket and OneDrive and so forth. This is all built in and easy to be done. Next big feature is the fact of the hosting options, right? And I'm going to talk more about this here in a moment, but the whole idea that I can either do a consumption or I can have a premium plan or so forth. And let me come back to that. I actually have a slide dedicated to hosting options. All right, next is built-in security and compliance. I, I was a little bit hesitant putting this on. Microsoft has a little bit of trouble here in the United States for security. I mean, they're working on that. But sure enough, when we do look at Azure as a whole, Azure is very secure. They've done some really good jobs with it. They do make sure they comply with pretty much any type of a client compliance regulations out there. So you can feel pretty safe that you are starting on a good platform to start with, and then you can continue to build on top of that. And then you have your flexible pricing. This is a key tenet. So Azure Functions is what is called a function as a service type service, and one of those key tenets is the fact that you're only paying for what you're using, right? And that's one of the real big benefits here. And then you have your scalability. And again, another feature of that function as a service. I don't actually go in and say, hey, I know that at some point I'm going to need 5 instances of that Azure function running, because as more people make calls to that. All I say is I need an Azure function, right? And then Azure takes care of saying, okay, well, you don't have anything coming in, so we're going to scale all the way down to 0. And then as you get more and more requests come in, it will scale itself up until the point that it meets the need, right? And I will show a demo of that, of showing because that's actually one of the big things that they've that is new, not new, but it's enhanced in Azure Functions, is the way how it scales, and it's scaling out so much more faster now. And then you have the fact that you have your serverless workflows. So when we normally talk about a function as a service, we're talking about very small pieces of code that have no persistence. So it does not remember what it did before. But at times we need workflows, right? And we need orchestrations. We need to be able to do several things in a step. So prime example, like I said, we're at Jasper. We're in the middle of moving some legacy code to production, to the cloud. And one of the things that we're working on is a process to do a monthly update. So we have our set of data, right? And we are considered to be an industry leader, but we get information from because we're dealing with all the auto manufacturers, mostly U.S. based, but a couple Europeans, couple of Japanese companies also, and so we collect this, we get information from public sources, and on a monthly process, we go in and we do deltas to determine what has changed based upon what we have. We run this really large monthly update process, and we're doing that through a serverless workflow, right? So it is using the benefits of Azure Functions, the short pieces of code that run really quickly, scale up and scale down, but also in a workflow, right? That's what we're talking about here. And then the final feature I always like to talk about is the fact that Azure Functions is open source, which is really nice. I can go out to GitHub. I can see the code that is running behind there. Honestly, the biggest reason why I like it being open source is that, when you have really big problems that are, just really bring you down, and the support team can't help you, you can open up issues within, in the repository, and you're going to get the team to respond to it. Now, obviously, don't only do that for really big problems that are they're real problems, not you're trying to figure out which tool to use and so forth, right? But there's that ability. All right, so I said I was going to talk about hosting options, and sure enough, there are a bunch of hosting options. All right, so at the top we've got the consumption. That is, again, what we normally think about with Azure Functions. And as I say, that's your true serverless option, right? The idea that I only pay for what I use. When it, and when it's not in use, it scales all the way down to 0. And then when it does get used, it scales up, and it continues to scale up as far as I need. Next, we have the premium. And, basically, this I put this as sort of serverless because one of the big caveats with with premium is that it never goes fully to sleep. So at all times, there's always at least one instance of premium running. And that's not the whole reason why you would use premium. That is a reason, but also premium is a premium service in the sense that it's faster CPUs, more memory is available for you, so you can do some more things. And in today's world, and I'm about to talk about this here in a moment, but things like if I need virtual networking, right? So go back to Jasper. Jasper, we have a lot of legacy systems that are on-prem. We need to connect. We need to go from the cloud back to our own data center, and so we're currently using premium because of that. That's you cannot do that in consumption. Then there's a couple other models, right? So you have your dedicated, so I can actually run this in a service plan. I can run them in container apps, and then on the bottom we see several others, right? The service environment is basically another way of saying the service plan, but it's a more secure version of this. The Azure Stack, so you can run Azure on your own data center, but you can also run Azure Functions on your own servers, right? It is open source. It's completely open to do so. And sure enough, when you do development, local development, that's what you're doing. You're running those on your machine, right? It's not an emulator. You're actually running the function runtime. And then there is also abilities to do this on devices. So when we look at these, right, we have these couples, but now there's also flex consumption. And this is an amazing thing. I really love flex consumption. It is currently in public preview, right? But I first heard about flex consumption back in March of last year. I was at the MVP Summit, and Microsoft presented this new thing they were working on, and I've just been so excited about this. And then sure enough, it was like October of last year, I think it was, that they opened up a private preview, and I've been playing with flex consumption. We are at our company, we are waiting for it to go to general availability, which I believe will be in November. That hasn't been stated, but that's a good idea. So, but what are we talking about flex consumption? Well, let's talk about that. And again, that preview flag, I definitely want to identify this is preview. Although I will say what is there is working, and is working very well. Microsoft did test this with some very large customers of theirs, so things are already working pretty well. So you can feel safe to start looking at this. So what are some things it's handling? Well, one, the biggest serverless issue we have is cold starts. And what do I mean by cold starts? Well, again, I said that in a consumption model, right? Your Azure function, when there's no calls to it, will scale all the way down to 0, right? And sure enough, it generally looks for no executions within 20 minutes. And it does depend on the triggers and exactly what's happening. But you can generally pretty much assume if you don't have a call to that Azure function app within 20 minutes, that Azure function app is going to scale all the way down to 0. So, and by cold start, what we mean is this: when you get the next call to that, it takes a moment to start up, right? A .NET Azure function can take between 2 and 40 seconds to start back up before it's actually ready to start processing that actual request. And obviously, and something that is expected to run fast. And most Azure functions, unless you're doing a whole lot of work in them, they're sub-seconds, right? So that 2 to 20 seconds, that's a long delay. So what has Azure done to help with this? Well, again, in premium functions, I talked about that, how it actually never scales all the way down to 0. You go down to 1. So it's called it always ready. And you could have more than 1, right? Because you could say, hey, I know that, we might scale all the way down to 0, but when we start getting calls, we get a lot of calls, and we need, we're going to quickly spin back up a whole lot. So you have that ability. In consumption functions, technically you wait. Now, I will say there are a couple of ways how you can get around that. With some success, I have done like an Azure timer trigger that will then call my HTTP trigger, like every 15 minutes and keep it awake, right? So there are some ways around that, but that always ready is definitely a better way of doing this. Well, flex consumption, and this is where that part of that idea of the flex, I have options. And one of those options is to have always ready when I want, right? So if I have an Azure function and 1, I'm not worried about the cold start, or 2, I know I'm not going to have cold starts because, it's pretty constantly being used, that type of thing. I have that option to turn this on. And this is kind of like what this looks like. So in this example, you could see that this Azure function app is set up to have 2 instances always running. And then as demand kicked in, it started loading up those Azure functions. Now, I'm going to talk about billing here in a moment, what things cost. But I will tell you, real simple here, those two always ready, you are paying for those the whole time you have always ready turned on, right? And then you're paying for each one. Those on-demand instances, you're not paying for the on-demand in itself. You're paying for the fact that you have executions coming in and then the amount of space in memory, in time that it is using. But you don't pay for those instances. But the always ready, you do pay for. All right, next big feature. I talked about this, the virtual network support. So today, if you want VNet support, you have to go to premium functions. That's or you go to the ASE. I mean, there's a couple other options, but when we're talking about the more serverless model, I have to go to the premium. Well, one of the problems about premium here in the United States, premium is approximately $155 a month. And if I have a low usage Azure function and I need, virtual network support, that's a really high cost to pay for that, right? So it's really great that we've added this feature in, and sure enough, we see, we can do pretty much what you're thinking about: your inbounds, your network integrations, your networking triggers, things that you can, things that you would expect to be able to do, you will be able to do, and no additional cost for this, right? This is all included with flex consumption. All right, the next big option, and this again also something taken from the premium, but with a little bit less different options. But the idea that I can actually specify how much memory my Azure function instance has, right? Each instance has, not the function app, but each instance of the app. As of right now, you have two options. Basically 2 gigabytes or 4 gigabytes of memory. The default is 2 gigabytes. Really interesting. During the preview, we also had 512 megabytes, and that is currently not available. I would expect that to come before we hit general availability, because, like I say, it was there in the private preview, and there is promise for more, right? So for even bigger instances. And so forth. But again, the idea that we can specify this, and the key thing to think here is that the more memory that my instance has, the more that my instance can do, right? And there's a couple of things you can think about that. The more that a single Azure function can do, but also the more Azure functions I can run with an instance. And while pricing is not exactly the way it works that way, but it does work in the sense of what I'm paying for, because I do pay for the amount of memory I'm using. And sure enough, in that consumption model, you don't specify the instance memory, so whatever you use, you get charged for it, and it's in 128 megabyte chunks. So if I'm using, say, 600 megabytes, I'm actually being charged for, was it 700 some odd? I can't do the math off the top of my head, but point being, so that's one of the things that we do look at with this. Whereas here we know currently, the default, I know I'm always going to be paying for 2048. So it does help me set my price, figuring out my monthly pricing. Next big feature that we get in flex consumption is this per instance concurrency, right? So the idea of how many concurrent executions of the Azure function will I allow within an instance. Now, in all honesty, most of us will never touch this value, right? Microsoft is already doing some great work to figure this out, and so you generally do not need to touch this. But there are times you need to do this, where you need to do some certain rules on how you're optimizing your usage. To include, if you have think about this, if you have an Azure function that doesn't use a lot of memory in itself, you could override what Azure Functions is doing and put more things in, more instances within each, more Azure function executions within each instance. That's what I'm trying to say. Here's a visualization of that. The first one here, we see that 10 requests came in. We had a concurrency of 1, so we have 10 instances being created. And let it be known, billing wise, I am currently paying, on that instance, I'm paying 10 times 2048 times the number of seconds, right? So that's one of the things to think about that with this. Whereas in this other one, 10 requests come in, we have a concurrency of 2, so I start up 5 instances. And again, that would mean I'm paying for 5 instances of that. Like I say, Azure does have its defaults. Interesting enough, and I was told why Python is only 1, and I have forgotten. I need to find that out again. Sure enough, I do not do a whole lot of Python, so I'm not too much concerned about that for my needs. But we see, any other language, you could probably notice a trend here. 512 megabytes is 4 instances, or 4 executions per instance. 2048 megabytes is 16, and then 32, right? So it's multiples of 4, right? And again, this is based upon math that Microsoft has done to figure out. They're basically saying that they pretty much know, but in average, an Azure function uses 128 megabytes, right? But again, let's just say you're doing that 512, that your Azure function is doing a little bit more. Maybe you'll scale it down to 2, right? Or your Azure function is really efficient and using less. You can scale it more than 4, right? That's the idea here. Next big thing is this per function scaling, right? So Azure Functions does a lot of math to figure out how to scale up your Azure Functions, and it works really well. But one of the things that we've always had with Azure Functions is there's this whole thing of don't mix your trigger types, right? And it's because scales are different. And this is one of these things that I can now handle this, right? And the great part, no code changes. This is all configuration, right? So, and it's not by the actual, it is by a mix. It is by type, and it can be by an Azure function itself. So here's an example of what this looks like. And there are a couple of special cases, what you see there. So you see these first 2 Azure functions. They are HTTP triggered Azure functions. That's one of the special cases. HTTP will always scale up together. And that probably makes sense, right? And again, how you divide up your Azure function apps, but that probably does make sense. Same thing with your durable functions. I talked about that serverless workflow. Azure calls those durable functions. And those also will scale together. And that makes a whole lot of sense. If you've got a workflow going, most likely, your orchestrator and your activities, they need to scale up together, right? And scale down together, right? So that makes sense. But most of your other Azure function types, you can scale them per, So, if I had, function 6, function 7 are service bus triggered events, well, those can scale on their own, right? And again, that means it can handle better the incoming messages coming into that. You can also scale out further, right? And this is one of the big things that has changed, when we look at consumption versus flex consumption, right? So in consumption, the max number of instances I can ever go to is 200. So if I have an Azure function that is really, really active, I cannot go above 200 instances. Sure enough, if you need more than 200 instances, they tell you to go to premium, right? Because you're probably paying too much for that consumption anyways, and premium at that time probably makes sense. But now we have another option, right? By default, the average the number of instances that max scale out is 100. You can actually make setting changes. I can get up to 1,000. Now, there's a little bit of a quota here that you have to note. So when we say 1,000 instances, well, currently, all those instances together within a region, within a subscription, cannot exceed 512,000 megabytes. All right. So when we talk about 1,000, note that right now the lowest memory setting I can have is 248. That means I can have 250 maximum instances. So, and consumption has the same similar type of rules. There is documentation states that, if you need more, you open up a support ticket. Microsoft will talk to you and say, hey, are you doing, is what you're doing the right thing, right? Or should we talk about other possibilities? But with this extreme scalability, we could do some really amazing things. So here, this is an actual chart. This isn't my chart. This came from Microsoft. This is a test that they were running with GitHub just prior to going to the public preview. And in this example, they were running nearly 1.6 million process events per second using one Flux consumption app, right? Triggering from a network restricted event hub. So pretty darn cool what they were doing here, right? So let's see an example of this. Now we're going to see how well this works. But so I've already created. Let me make sure. Because I was sharing the whole window. So you should be seeing my Azure function thing. I was just trying to see. There we go. So here I've already created this resource group in here. I've got this Azure function over here that you can see. But we've got this in a virtual network. That's where we see this over here. We've got an event hub that's ready to process events. And in this example, we have a system that is taking in customer feedback. It's doing a little bit of processing, and the Azure function, this function that will run in this app, will take that message, do something, and then we'll send it over. It will actually send it over to that event hub that is sitting in the virtual network. The Azure function is in the public, so they can be publicly accessible. So this is a prime example of what we would normally do. Sure enough, if we look at the Azure function, it looks just like anything else, right? Other than, if you notice, it says flex consumption. Make that a little bit bigger here. You'll see that it's flex consumption, right? But, and like I say, we have this process customer feedback Azure function. So what I want to show here, if we look right now, this Azure function app is asleep, right? There have not been any calls in the last 20 minutes. There haven't been any calls. I actually created this early this morning for me. For me, it's still morning time. But we can see that this was doesn't have anything running. So what we're going to do, I'm going to split the screen here so we can see this a little bit nicer. So because I'm going to start this test. Let me go ahead and start this, because the one part in this, what makes this demo a little bit hard, is that it takes a moment for the load test to start. So I've created a load test, and basically this is just going to hit that Azure function a lot. Every time I run this test, it will do approximately 604,000 instances within a minute. All right. So let's see here. It should be provisioning. This is the hard part. I can't, because it's got to do a provisioning and get everything set up. Unfortunately, I can't start that prior. I wish I could. But so we're gonna see this get going here. And this is the hard part, because I have to stall for a moment while this is getting started. So I am just waiting for this to get starting. Yeah, like I say, sometimes it's just, we'll give it a moment. We'll see if this does get started, because this does really show off how impressive this is. And actually, I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's try this, because I actually gave this presentation last week at another group, and this load test took a couple of minutes for it to actually execute, which was first. I mean, it's funny, as you build the slides, everything works just fine, right? But then when you actually try to start running it, you see that it's not as fast as you would like. So let's do this. We're gonna go back here. I'm gonna bring this window. I'm going to try to bring just this window. There we go. So I'm gonna talk a little bit while we're waiting to see this kick up here. Oh, okay. Hold on. It is executing. I might have stalled just long enough. Come on. Has it started here in the Azure function yet? Yeah, there we go. And look, it's already at 31 servers, right? That's basically what I want to just show, how quickly that scaled up. We can see the request coming in, just firing it like crazy. And like I say, if we wait the whole minute, we'll see approximately 604,000 requests that came in. This is really cool. And this is what I talk about, that extreme scalability. The fact that, I went from 0 to 31 servers handling all these requests coming in. We can see that we're looking at about 5,000 requests per second is coming in. And let it be known, I could have done more, right? I am actually running one instance of the load test. I easily could have created more, right? So that's what I wanted to show here. And that's kind of what we can see with flex consumption. A couple of other really great benefits. Talking about load testing, I haven't used this yet because this came out right near the end of the private preview, but they're integrating Azure load testing. And what is really interesting they're doing with this, one of the hardest parts about Azure Functions is figuring out how much are you really using. What happens when I go under load? Because again, I talked about your instance sizes and your concurrencies and all that type of stuff. They're actually building a tool that you can build a load test against your Azure function, and then it will test that against that, and it will make recommendations. It'll tell you, hey, by default, we're telling you, 30, you got 4 gigabyte of memory, which we're defaulting that to 32 instances. But we see you're really efficient. You could probably go up to 60. Yeah, and again, you'll save some money by doing that, right? So really cool that you're doing that. But also added in, better ways to get your telemetry data, and also, we can handle long execution time. So a consumption Azure function by default can only run for a max of 5 minutes. Now that's per function in execution, and you actually can go in the settings and change that to 10 minutes, but that's the max you can get. With flex consumption, it can run for as long as it needs to. I do caution you with that. My experience is Azure Function gets a little bit weird when it runs for a really long time. So you need to take you watch out with that. With that being said, there is a durable function. The idea of split that work up, and that's one way of handling it. All right. So the other big thing to talk about, pricing. All right. So what are we talking about pricing? So let's look at this, because I am running a little bit short on time here. But we'll be fine here. So there's 2 different things you pay for pricing. And I will say the pricing that I grabbed is the North Europe region. And there are some reasons for me grabbing that pricing, but you pay for 2 things. You pay for your on-demand. So the requests that come in and the amount of space of memory that those are using. And then, like I say, if you optionally turn on that always ready, you're going to pay for that. And here we can see, and again, this is the pricing for North Europe region. I'm assuming I'm mostly talking to people in Italy, and you would probably want to use the Italian Azure region. The reason why I'm not showing pricing for that is because actually flex consumption is not available yet in Italy. It is only in a couple of, or in a certain number of regions. So I am using this. I will say this, that is the pricing coming from the Microsoft page. Interesting enough, I have the $sign because that is what they show on there instead of showing like the euro sign. So I do not know if those prices I'm showing is US dollars or euro. That was a little bit unclear in that, but we can get an idea here, right? So, it is pretty cheap. I will say this, those 2 top lines, the on-demand pricing, those are the same pricing that you pay for a regular consumption app. The difference is the free grant, right? I do not remember the free grants in Europe because they are, or no, these are the same. On a consumption app, Azure Functions gives you 400,000 gigabyte seconds for free and 1 million executions for free. Whereas with a flex consumption, you get 100,000 and 250,000. And this makes sense, right? Because again, you're talking about a much faster process, better memory utilization, better scalability. So you do have to pay for those better features in some way, right? And then we see the pricing for the always ready. Right. So what does this all mean? What are some examples of how this goes? Well, and again, 5.12 is not available in the public preview at this moment. That will be coming back. But if we were to look at 3 million executions per month, each execution using 512 megabytes and running for approximately a second, or not for approximately a second, running for a second. In the regular consumption model, that will cost in the North Europe region 18, and again, $18 or euros. I'm not 100% sure. In the premium, it's 152.31. All right. So what does that cost in the flex consumption without always ready? 24.35. So again, it is going to cost a little bit more than that consumption, but in this example here, one, if I'm doing virtual networking, I didn't pay anything extra for it, or if I need it to burst really fast. I mean, I'm only running 3 million executions, but maybe that a lot of executions real quickly and it slows it back down, right? You're going to get better benefits there. If we look at a couple other examples, so let's say we turn on always ready. Let's say we need that always ready. So what are the pricing here we're looking at? Well, in this example here, same number of executions, same number of memory, same number of execution time. I just said that that 1% of the executions will be performed while idle. So basically, what are you paying to have it always ready turned on? You go up to 40, right? But again, that's because it never goes fully to sleep, right? I make sure that I always have one instance ready to go and take whatever happens, all right? I'm going to give you an actual scenario. So I talked about that monthly update that we're doing. We haven't put it into production, but our estimate is we're going to, that one in particular, we're going to do 434 executions per month. All right. It's going to execute at 2048 megabytes, and it runs for approximately 400 milliseconds, right? We just rounded up to 400 milliseconds. We do need virtual networking connectivity, but we do not need always ready. Cold starts are acceptable in this scenario. It is a monthly process that is automated. So if it actually takes even up to 20 seconds, and ours are not taking 20 seconds, they're taking about 5 seconds. That's fine, right? That actually, no one's going to notice that because this process is going to run for a little while. So what are we talking about? What does this look like? Well, in the consumption model, you can't do it, right? Because I need that virtual networking capability. And I also, or I said always ready, doesn't matter. Premium, 155.27. Right. And I am actually using US pricing here on purpose, right? Because because this is the example I've been using. So what is that going to cost me in the flex consumption? $4.16. I would definitely rather pay that $4.16 than $155.27. Right. That's an easy decision to make. All right. I think I'm running a little bit low in time, but we're going to try to march through here. I actually forgot what time I have until, but I think I have about 5 or 10 more minutes. We should be fine. A couple considerations. At this point, not all triggers are fully supported, and I do put that yet because they're coming. Right, a couple of those are not. A couple of the ones that are not supported. So Kafka, I'm actually surprised they're even talking about that. That to me sounds like they would always keep that in the premium because you can't run Kafka triggers in consumption right now. So. Interesting that they're talking about that, but sure enough, the one I'm a little bit bummed about, Azure SQL, is not supported yet. So that Azure SQL trigger allows you to watch for changes on your Azure SQL database, and when a change happens, you can trigger off of that. And then the Signal R trigger is not supported yet. And then the one that's not fully supported yet is the Blob trigger, and in particular, actually, the Blob trigger itself is not supported yet, but you could do that through the event grid source. And honestly, that is the way how you should do it, anyways. The way how the blob trigger works, it's a polling mechanism. And so it could take up to 10 minutes for that to actually trigger when a blob gets added into a storage account. Some other considerations. I mentioned this earlier. Not all regions are supported yet, right? So as of right now, here are the regions that are supported, right? You see quite a few. It's mostly in the United States. So for Europe is only that North Europe. I think that's the only one in Europe. Yes, that is the only one. UK South. Although I know UK is no longer. I mean, it's definitely on the euro, right? But so point being, right? In the actual euro, you only have North Europe, so that might be a consideration for today. But again, by the time they go to general availability, it will be available in all. I'm assuming it will be available in all regions. Right. Your deployment options are currently limited. By this, what I mean, you can do the CLI commands and such, but deploying to a flex consumption app is not supported in the GitHub actions or in the DevOps task. And sure enough, deployment slots are not supported yet. And again, this will come. I fully expect to see this way before we get to GA. There are some scaling limitations. And again, some of this is not that big a deal. That lowest maximum scale, that is a different number. So that's why I bring that up. But again, not really anything to worry about, unless I actually have had a scenario where I had to restrict an Azure function to never scale up more than one instance. Long story, but so I could not do that with Flux consumptions. That is something to think about. And then, like I say, the highest maximum scale is 1,000. I put that as a limitation, but it's not actually a limitation because that's a new feature, right? Like I said, today in consumption, the max is 200. So this is definitely a better number. Sure enough, you have limited support, right? It is preview functionality, right? So, if you actually do try to deploy something for a production application and it doesn't work, Microsoft support's going to tell you, sorry, that's not supported yet. Now again, that's where it being open source is great because there are some opportunities to go into the repo and open up issues. If you're seeing something that is probably more wide scale. All right, so demo, and this isn't really a demo. I'm going to show this on the screen. I just want to show a couple of the ways how we would do things when we're creating an app and managing it. So here we see the commands, right? So, this first command, like I said, right now, Flex consumption is not supported in all locations. Here is the command in the Azure CLI that we can get the list. So if we're creating an Azure function, we determine, we can create this in East US. So we'll create the resource group. You'll create your storage account. If you are a little bit unfamiliar with Azure Functions uses a storage account to store a lot of things, but in particular, the code that it runs. So here we're creating that storage account we need. Nothing has changed here. Here is the first thing where we see a change other than the fact of the limited number of regions that are available. And that highlighted value, that's the one thing we see different. It's now flex consumption location, right? And that is what tells Azure to create a flex consumption Azure function. So once you've got your function app created, you would generally what I'm doing is I'm running the func command. You also can do the AZD, which is the newer CLI commands. That does also work. But I usually find this one a little bit easier to do because the AZD does require you use bicep and so forth. This does not, right? So, that's what we have here. So enabling virtual network integration. I just want to show how easy this is. Well, first you would need to create your virtual networking. That's the obvious piece. And then here I've created this subnet that I can use. And then I can say in the Azure CLI, go ahead and associate, turn on virtual networking and add it to this thing. And sure enough, you can do this in the portal also. But I do like showing this because we do a lot more automation more and more. And also you can create, you can add that virtual networking integration when you create the Azure function. So if you're going to need it right up front, you go ahead and create that. Configuring instance memory, also very easy to do, which is great. You can change these whenever you need to, right? But again, remember, currently in the preview, you only have 2048 and 4096. And here you can see we're setting that to 4096. Here we see that always ready instance. So here we're saying scale, configure my scaling. And in this example, I'm actually saying for my HTTP triggered events in that function app, I wanted to, I want to set the always ready to 10. So that's the other thing I didn't talk about earlier, but the always ready can also be for a particular type of Azure function, right? So that's also a neat thing to do here. Concurrency limits, also very simple in what we're seeing here. You see the, um, you know, set my configuration here. I'm saying, again, for an HTTP trigger type, allow 10 executions that happen within a single instance. All right, so some decisions, right? Because like I said, we now have all of these different types of hosting models. When would you use each of these? Well, consumption, basically use this for your sporadic workloads. And sporadic, it depends on what you mean, right? I gave that example of 3 million executions per month. Some might not call that very sporadic. That's a lot of executions in a month. But uh, other than if you need the ability to manage your you need VNet or whatever, the consumption makes a lot of sense because of the pricing model, right? Your flex consumption, here is where you're going to use this when you need more control over your concurrency, and what you pay as you go, right? Because again, you're going to have more knowledge on that because you're specifying your memory, or when you need that VNet support for your quote unquote sporadic low workloads, right? I mean, again, makes a whole lot of sense here. You're going to use your premium when you have a lot of function apps that you're going to run, right? And you need the event-driven scaling. You need more compute power, right? Sure enough, I mean, you actually specify the V core type you have in the preview, right? So you'll use it then. Or you have a high use workload and you need virtual networking, then the premium will make sense there. Use your dedicated. Two main things I would say here. One, when you already have an app service plan you're not fully utilizing, it might make sense to do there. Or where you need that long running scenario that durable functions cannot be used. And then finally, your container apps. I got to admit, I have not played with. I use container apps. I haven't played with the container apps on Azure Functions. But to me, this is when you need to mix your you've got container apps and you've got Azure Functions that are working together, as part of the same servers or what have you. Or you need that Dapper support because that is one of the benefits you get in here. So you can use like the Dapper sidecars right in there. Or a prime example is when you want to take a legacy code and you want it to be triggered off of a triggerable, like what Azure Function can trigger off of. So just some hopefully helpful reasons why to use each of these different hosting plans. So again, I hope you do vote for my session. I hope you did enjoy this. I hope you got something out of this. Like I say, flex consumption to me is an amazing thing to see. I'm so happy to see this coming. I'm really looking forward to this coming, into general availability because I do think it really does give us a lot of great functionality. So with that, again, thank you so much for having me. I hope you had a great day here at Azure Roma, and I hope you have a great weekend as the weekend gets going. Thank you so much.